So, what's worship? I mean, people talk about styles of worship. People talk about showing up to worship, like we're doing this morning. People talk about putting on your favorite worship music and probably singing along at some point, whether you're doing that with people or all by yourself. And all of that is worship. In fact, I think that one of the reasons God put music into our hearts is across all times and all cultures is so that people could use music and worship and singing to worship Him. But I also believe there's more to worship than just music and singing. And that there's more to worship than just showing up at church somewhere or carving out your own private little worship time wherever you happen to be. I mean, I don't know if the wise men actually sang a note when they came to see Jesus. But I do know that they came there to worship Him, uh, whether they were singing or not. In fact, that's the whole reason they showed up. Here's the quote on that one again. Matthew chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea when King Herod was king. After Jesus' birth, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem. They asked him, "Where is the one who's been born to be king of the Jews? We saw his star rising and have come to worship him." We have come to worship him. That's the purpose that we're here. That's the whole reason we made this whole big trip. That's why we showed up. That's why we're looking for Him now, because God is doing something big, and we're seeking this God. We saw a star in the east, a sign telling us that He's here. So we've come for this very purpose, to worship Him, which seems to indicate to me that worship is more than just music and singing or showing up. So let's dig a little deeper into their story. Matthew tells us that the wise men came from the east somewhere. And we don't know exactly where that was, other than it was east of where Jerusalem was. But putting some clues together, a whole lot of scholars think that probably they came from somewhere around ancient Persia. And we also know that, well, they're looking for Jesus. They didn't know Jesus yet, and they probably were not believers yet in the one true God, but they were seekers. They were seekers, and perhaps the seeking itself, the seeking itself and the desire to find God and His presence is perhaps one of the places where worship starts. All right. Behind the scenes, God's already been seeking you, whether you know it or not. Behind the scenes, God has been doing incredible things for you, and He set signs and patterns out there for you to notice Him and to seek Him and to wonder if He could be who or what that you're actually seeking. But in your own conscious thoughts, your worship kind of starts with your seeking God and trying to figure out what He's up to. Now these particular seekers were scholars and scientists. And one of the things that these scholars and scientists did was study the stars. And as they observed nature over the course of many years, one of the patterns that they noticed was that the stars were consistent in their movement across the sky, season after season, year after year, so that then when this special, incredibly brilliant star appeared out of nowhere, out of the pattern, it was to their mind saying that God, whoever He was breaking into His world and making some announcement that something big was about to happen. So as they look at the stars, they see that God is up to something, and they started trying to determine, well, what's the significance of that? So they recognized that this God, who they didn't even know yet, was up to something really big. And they started to sense that I think maybe God is trying to do something in me and in my life, and perhaps God wanted to draw them to his presence, and so they started seeking. And again, it's that seeking, I think, where our worship of God begins, because worship isn't just knowledge of God and knowing things about God. It's actually experiencing God and seeking to experience God and to get into his presence. So the worship starts in the seeking itself. And let me ask you, do you think God still works the same way? So are you still seeking? Whether you know him or you're starting to? Are you looking for the signs and the patterns of where God's working in the world and how he's moving in your life to draw you to him? And if you are, well, then what's next? Well, it's pretty likely that these wise men at this point then consulted Bible, the ancient Hebrew scriptures, which to say, well, what do we do next? Even though they didn't accept these ancient Hebrew scriptures here as Bible, as God's word, they still saw a value in looking at the ancient texts. And so as they're digging into these ancient texts, which probably got into their presence by Jewish exiles some 600 years or so before they were even living, they're digging into these texts, and they're seekers, and they're saying, well, what do these texts have to say about what I'm seeing and observing? And not only were they digging into the texts, they were doing it with other people, right? There was more than one wise person that made the trip, right? There were several wise men, however many that they were, and they pored over those texts together. And then they came to the conclusion in pouring over those texts together that, again, God's up to something, and he's up to something way in this ancient land of Israel, far to the west of us, and so off they went. And I think, again, we can learn something there, because as you're seeking God, those same things today will help you to find his presence in your life. It's what they did, reading Bible and having conversations with other people who are doing that too. Which leads me to another aspect of worship that I find in their story here, and that's that worship takes some work and some effort. I mean, if you think about the trip that they made, it's probably an 800 to 1,200 mile trip. It's going to take a lot of time to plan that and to get the logistics all lined up. It's going to take a significant amount of money to put this together. It's going to be, at that time, a 1 to 2 year trip for them, and then the same amount of time going back to their homeland again. That is no small amount of effort. Okay, it's a big amount of work and effort. And you get that, right? Because if part of your worship experience is showing up in church on a Sunday or on any day, you know that sometimes it can be really hard to get to church. I mean, you got other stuff going on. And you're tired from the day before, or the week before, or the night before. And every day you get up early for your job or for school. And so if there's a weekend that you don't have to do that, even if you're not getting up as early as you normally were getting up, you're just like, well, I don't really want to go anywhere. That's just not all that appealing. And sometimes, even if worship is your habit, well, you get tired of the habit, right? Like you get tired of going to school every day, or going to the job every day, or doing the same, if you're retired, doing the same little drudgery thing that you have on the to-do list every single day. And sometimes you just like, I don't want to do it. Pretty soon it's, do I have to? And let's say that you've decided, no, I'm going to do this. I am going to show up. Do you ever notice how sometimes that it just takes effort to get in the door? Do you remember when you had kids? How sometimes immediately everything was fine, and then you started going to church, and the kids went crazy, and breakfast couldn't get together, and everybody was yelling at each other, and then you still got in the car, and all the lights seemed to turn red, and you're just getting later and later, and you're just like, I'm going to turn around, because it takes effort to get here. It's hard just showing up to church, right? It takes work and it takes effort, and I commend you for being here. I get that. But maybe the story of the wise men helps us understand that work and effort is part of the deal. Work and effort's part of the deal. Most things, good things, actually require some work and effort to be put into it. Expect that. The wise men did. But when you put the work and the effort in to get here, you notice something else. That in God's presence, like the wise men did, you notice that worship also begins to change your attitude. Right? Worship actually changes your attitude, which, believe it or not, is actually necessary. I mean, part of the reason it's necessary is because we're all born thinking that the universe revolves around us. I mean, what are little babies like? That's why babies cry a lot. They cry a lot because it's like, that's their way of expressing, this is all about me. So feed me and change me and hold me and burp me and play with me and feed me again, and on and on and on it goes, because that's their way of saying the world revolves around me. And well, actually, that me-centered view of the world, it's still there, even though we grow up. And we grow up and we see that there are other people in the world around us, and we have to deal with other people in our lives, those other people have needs too, but we still tend to see ourselves as the center of the picture. And as we're the center of the picture, our needs and our wants and our desires come before everybody else, and when they don't, we get a little grumpy. Right? Well, on paper, with the economic scale and the way things worked in their world, the wise men would be people who would say, yeah, the world all revolve around me. They're in the top of society, maybe even 1%ers. And so you'd think when they get there, they'd say, well, this story is about us. Except that's not what their attitude was. Let me read it to you again. Matthew 2, verse 11. They bowed down and worshiped him. And bowed down isn't like, taking a bow. That word bowed down there means literally they laid face down on the ground. Their whole body just kind of lying there. Well, and they probably had robes like this. Can you imagine? They're lying flat like this in front of this little child who could give them nothing from all appearances. And as they did that, they said, it's not like, look at us. You're happy that you ought to be happy that we made the trip here. It's like, we're totally vulnerable. God, we are in awe. We're in awe that we're here. We're in awe of you. We're in awe that you wanted us to find you. We're in awe that you sent this special star for us to get here and guide us. We're in awe that you have come so close that we can actually see you and touch you and experience you in our lives. And so we humbly lay our lives before you. We're on holy ground. Holy ground. I wonder what effect that would have on our worship if we saw the same thing. Not only that God was drawing us here, but that God was actually showing up here. And that as we were here, we were actually experiencing the presence of God. And that this space that you worship in is actually holy ground. I mean, if you recognize that it was a space and a time, as Alex said, set apart for experiencing God and for God coming close to you, would that change your attitude about church? Would that change what you did and how you approach this time and this church space? Would there be some holy ground element to our worship? I think so. And I think maybe you'd also then find something else. In that attitude, you also rediscover that the closer and closer you come into God's presence, the more you experience joy. I mean, that's what the wise men, Matthew 2, verse 10, they were overwhelmed with joy to see the star. Could you use some of that in your life, being overwhelmed with joy? Worship, it says, actually gives that to you the closer and closer you draw into God's presence. And God knows that you need that. Not only that you see him, but that you need a little more joy, and he's guiding and directing and leading you to worship because he knows that that's going to put that joy in your life. And then here's another thing I notice about worship. That worship here isn't just thinking and talking and singing and contemplating and experiencing the presence of God. Worship's also giving of yourself. Did you notice that in the story? It's giving of yourself. I mean, now the wise men had already given a significant amount of time and effort and energy just to get there, but they didn't stop with that. There's no, oh, that's good enough in their vocabulary. No, well, we've done what we have to in their thought process, but we're not going to do a single step more. Again, if you follow the story through, what happens when they got there? After they bowed down and worshiped him, Matthew reports this. Then they opened their treasure chests and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Those were rare gifts. I mean, costly gifts, precious gifts. And it was the best that they have to give, not the least that they thought they could get by with to make an acceptable showing. And if you notice here, they gave both joyfully and generously, even though no one else would have known if they were just doing enough to do what they thought they had to get by or to make an acceptable showing, which makes me pause and think as I was looking at it this week about the offerings and gifts that I give. I mean, the wise men obviously had a plan for what they did. Do I? And the wise men gave from the first that they had planned to bring, not from, oh, well, this is what we got left over. Do I do that? The wise men gave their best, not what they thought was the minimum that they could get by with that was acceptable. Again, do I? I mean, our financial gifts are as much an offering to God of worship as our singing is. I remember once I had somebody years ago ask me why I gave to church at all, because it was just like paying myself, right? Because lights and salaries and things come out of the money that we give to church. And I get where he was coming from, because I understand the world's mostly kind of transactional. But he didn't get it, because giving is an act of worship. That's why I give. You give because it's an act of worship to God. And I think the wise men understood that. They gave their time, they gave their talent, but they also here gave financially, and they gave generously, and they gave joyfully, perhaps because they understood that giving is an act of worship. And isn't that what God is doing in Jesus? Isn't that sort of generosity what's close to God's heart? I like how Paul puts it. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Though he was rich, and that's speaking, the he there is Jesus. though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Giving isn't just close to the heart of God. Giving is the heart of God. And isn't that a desirable thing to have? The heart of God? So, action step for this week, just kind of reflect and ask yourself honestly, what does my financial giving say about my heart? What does it say about my worship? And then as you reflect, if you need to make some changes, do. And that's important because one final thing I notice here is that at the end of this story, another part to worship is obedience. Obedience. Hearing what God says and listening to it and actually following through. Matthew chapter 2, verse 12, last sentence of the story. God warned them in a dream not to go back to Herod. Okay? Now they got a choice. Do I go back and do what Herod said, or do I do what God said? Here's what Matthew reports. They had left for their country by another road. Herod told them to do one thing. God told them to do the other. They did what God told them to do. That's worship. That's obedience. That's a part of worship. I love how Paul summarizes again this whole idea of worship being more than just music and singing. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. This is your true and proper worship. Offering your bodies, offering your whole lives as an offering of worship to God. So how can you develop that sort of worship in your life? Worship that's not a transaction or a minimum obligation, but a response. A response to God's grace and mercy and love. A response to the big things that you see God doing in the world. A response to the big things that God's done for you. A response to the signs and the patterns that you see that God's putting in the world so that you can seek him, and a response that puts in the effort to keep seeking him. A response that gives the first and the best, both joyfully and generously. A response that goes where God leads and does what God says. A response that actually puts joy back in your heart and draws you closer and closer to the presence of the living God. I mean, worship is a lot more than just music and singing, isn't it? Music and singing is an awesome part, but worship is a whole lot more of it. My whole life is actually an offering of worship and praise to God for all that Jesus has done in seeking and finding me and drawing me deeper and deeper into his presence. And that's why wise men and wise women and wise children still seek him. Still seek him and still respond by asking, what can I give to God for all that he's done for me? Maybe more to the point, what will I?